A world of pure imagination is coming to town, and Willy Wonka has your golden ticket to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
This is the Broadway musical, all right? How many of you have actually read the book? Okay. Oh, that's a good number. All right. Now, typically, that's not something that's on an adult person's nightstand. You know, it's just something you probably read when you were a kid. Roald Dahl wrote this book. It was published in 1964 in the U.S. He's a British writer. If you've watched the Drunk History episode about him, you will discover all sorts of crazy cool things about him. But apparently, he was a British spy and wrote a bunch of children's books. Kind of cool, right? Well, so he wrote this story, and it took a little bit of time for it to catch on, but really what people really remember is the movie, right? Now, how many of you have watched the movie with Gene Wilder? And okay, that's just about everybody, right? But what's the movie called? Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, right? So what they realized when they were making, or when they started talking to the Dahl estate about making a screenplay out of his book, was that when they were doing this film, they realized that the character of Willy Wonka would be the thing that people would remember, but not a character named Charlie. And so that's why the movie got renamed. Another thing I'll tell you, remember in the movie, in the very beginning, what Gene Wilder does when he's walking toward the gate? Does someone remember what he does? Any of the kids? Yeah, what do you remember? He fake falls. That's right, you remember that? Where he feels like he's an old man and he's walking out, and then he kind of does a forward roll, and he goes, "Ba-ping." Well, what's really interesting about that is that he required them to put that in the movie, otherwise he wouldn't do it. It's not in the book. It's not in the story. And when asked about, well, why in the world would you want to do that? He said, well, the thing is that at the beginning of the movie, the audience needs to know, or they need to continually question whether or not I'm lying. And so when I'm faking being this old man and then I pop up and I'm a younger man and very able, that sets the tone for the rest of the movie, where you're not really sure what's true and what's false and what's real and what's not. It's kind of cool, right? And he didn't hurt himself. If you've heard that, he did not hurt himself. It's not a Chevy Chase moment where he fell down the stairs. He was fine, okay? Well, that movie actually cost $3 million to make in the early 70s. That's a lot of money, okay? But it did well at the box office. It earned in that year $4 million. So it sort of paid for itself, which is good. But that was it. Nobody really was like, oh, I just love Willy Wonka. It just was not, it didn't catch on until 10 years later. And does anybody know what was going on about 10 years later in the early 80s? Like what was happening? Anybody remember back about movies were going on. There was still some, I remember going to war games, right? But there were other things going on in your home. Videos, right? Those gigantic VHS players that took up a whole room, right? Well, not only that, so it was one of those films that got released when VHS and Betamax got released, right? By the way, Betamax lost, just so you know. But because of that, it started to become more and more of a cult classic because people could watch it at home. And so that's why it got so popular. Not because it did well in the theaters, but because it did well in homes. And that's very true for a lot of cult classics today. Well, fast forward into, much, much later, about, at this point, 2009, about then, an idea percolated about creating a Broadway musical based on the book, okay? Now, we're not going to talk about the Johnny Depp, Willy Wonka from 2005, I think is when it was. It's still a little crazy and creepy, right? But there are a lot of people that love it. It's Tim Burton, and so, you gotta love some Tim Burton. But some guys got together and they were like, you know what, we really need to try to make this musical. We think it's gonna work because there's music in the movie that's really iconic that people remember. And so they got together, they started writing this thing, and it had its first reading in 2010 in New York City. So it's that old. Now, obviously what they did then is not what you're gonna see today or over the next few days. But they wound up getting some producers on board, they reworked the show and the music, and then it opened in the West End in London. And it ran for 3.5 years. And it has the record still for the largest grossing musical of weekly grosses in the West End. It was making so much money that it rose to the top of that kind of list of shows that was making lots of money. I mean, even more than Phantom in the West End, right? And that's a juggernaut. So, obviously they're like, well, we gotta take it to New York City, it's gotta go to Broadway. So, the problem is that the creative team from the West End wasn't the same as the Broadway team. Sam Mendes directed the West End production, and he's a movie director, he's very well known, but obviously he's got more projects than any of us can think about, so he couldn't direct the show for Broadway. They got a man named Jack O'Brien to direct it, who's a very well-known Broadway director. They got together, they rewrote some of the show, they rewrote some of the music, and they reimagined some of the characters. And it opened to Broadway. It ran for about 14 months, and then it closed. And then it hit the road. And it hit the road for about a year, and then COVID shut everything down, right? The time that shall not be named, okay? Well, it reopened just about 10 months ago now, and slowly has been getting back on the road. And so we're very fortunate to have it over the next few days. So I'm glad that you're here. I'm not gonna share any of the magic of the show with you, but you can imagine there's a lot of it. The music is great, and this particular company is doing some really extraordinary work. So some of you like to hear about the DNA of the show. So this particular show is 4 semi-trailers big. It's only 4. And that's still a lot, by the way. But if you've been to these before and you've heard, like, oh, well, Hamilton was 11 trucks, well, yeah, okay.